Thank you so much for joining us back here on OU Sports Podcast from OU Daily. I'm Colton Sulley, the daily sports editor this fall, and from here on out, we are in full football mode. We are fully recovered now from our trips to Arlington and Nashville to both Big 12 and SEC Media Days. On Tuesday, we will be at the stadium for OU's Media Day, where we will talk to every OU coach as well as several players. So that should be a very busy and content-heavy day on OUDaily.com. I'll be out there alongside one of our assistant sports editors this fall, Raser, who is here with me and will be all season long on the pod to cover everything for you. And then on Thursday, OU gets going with its first practice of fall camp ahead of its week 1 matchup with Arkansas State on September 2nd. OUDaily.com will have you covered for content all throughout camp, and make sure to look out for our annual football mag dropping on racks all around campus August 28th. In time for that season kickoff. Not much else to say at the top of the show. Let's get into it. Lewis and I are going to set the scene for fall camp. Lewis, how you doing?
Doing well, Colton. Really excited to be here and very excited for football season.
For sure, for sure. Let's just get into it. As I said in the open, training camp starts this week. So excited. It seems like football season is upon us. Can't wait for those fall that fall weather to follow, but ready to start covering some football, get back into it, and get this pod out regularly. As you heard in the open, we have a new name for this podcast. It's going to be called OU Sports Podcast from OU Daily. We're just kind of combining the past goal-oriented and Twitter Spaces into this one here podcast, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But Lewis, first, just wanted to kind of recap. We talked on the last pod about our trips to Big 12 Media Days, and then I think our SEC Media Day pod got cut a little short on Twitter Spaces as we were in the car traveling back from Nashville. But what were your top line experiences from both of those trips?
Well, both were just really, really fun trips. I thought it was just interesting to kind of compare and contrast just the Big 12 media days, how everything in the Big 12 is handled versus the SEC, the conference that OU is going to be joining next year. Both were really, really fun. And like you said, football season is upon us. It's been, 7 months since Oklahoma has played football. Just one more month of waiting, and we'll be there.
For sure, for sure. And then I want to dive into, we already talked Big 12 Media Days, but just since it was the last time we heard from head coach Brent Venables and players, I just kind of wanted to dive back into the storylines from that event to preview Tuesday's availability, which we will write about and you can follow on OUDaily.com, as I said, in our various social media platforms. But I really thought Brent Venables is couple of press conferences he did there in Arlington were very, very interesting. And last year on the podcast, I talked a lot about, Brent Venables and his new staffs, their inability to execute down the stretch in the fourth quarter, new head coach, new staff, Brent trying to work on the defense, but also Ted Roof's the defensive coordinator, trying to manage an entire roster for the first time. There's a lot of, little things that go into that. And I found Coach Venables' reflection on last season very interesting and very telling. He talked a lot about efficiency, football, and executing in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter as something that he's really hit hard in the film room this summer with his staff. And I'm really excited on Tuesday to dive into that further with offensive coordinator Jeff Lebby, offensive line coach Bill Bedenbaugh, and just talk about how the offense and as well as the defense with Brent and Ted Roof, sharing responsibilities there on how, messages are getting across. We know Ted Roof worked in the booth last year. I kind of want to just dive in to see, what changes are going to be made in that aspect of the game day on the field. And then something else I also found interesting from Coach Venables' press conferences at Big 12 was he talked a lot about the incoming transfers, but what I'm finding more interesting and what I really want to dive in on this week is the development of the returning players. Not only is this Brent's second year in getting, him and his staff, used to Oklahoma and the way he wants to do things. It's also these players the second year in what is a really tough scheme that Coach Venables brought over. You think of players like Danny Stutzman, Billy Bowman, who are returning players, and everybody talks about the transfers and everything. But I'm really excited to see both Danny and Billy and see how they've grown all summer long. What do you think about that, Lewis?
Yeah, definitely. We had a good chance to talk to Danny Stutzman over at Big 12 Media Days. And I think just the overall message is, he's maturing, he's stepping into that leadership role that somebody on this defense has to step up into if they want to see improvements this upcoming year. But at the same time, I mean, he's still Danny Stutzman. He's got the crazy hair going now, the curly hair going. Personally, a fan of that, but he's still the goofy, wacky, fun guy that he is. And along with that, he is seeing some maturity, particularly on the field. I thought talking to Drake Stoops was interesting there, just getting a sense of, this is a very young, inexperienced wide receiver room. You lose Marvin Mims last year. Now Stoops has to really, really step up in his sixth year. So we talked about a lot about that, a lot about some of the younger guys and what to expect from them. We'll get to that later on this podcast. But yeah, those were my kind of main takeaways from Big 12.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of, I'm glad you brought up Danny Stutzman's maturity. Brent talked a lot about learning through failure, not only himself but his players. And the story has been told 100 times at this point. About how Brent and Danny had a really, a talk when Brent first got here, and it was like, you need to make some changes, man. You need to look at yourself in the mirror and make some changes. And it seems like Danny's done that, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with him more as the season goes on and watching him on the field. But just overall, this week or last week now, we saw OU held the Sooners under the stars and party at the Palace this past weekend. And with the recruiting, we've heard all of the family atmosphere stuff, but I really got that sense from Big 12 Media Days as well. Just every player you talk to, they give you the same answers. And we talked about that last season on the podcast pretty frequently, but it seems like Brent Venables is just hammering down the same messaging to every single player on the roster. And that family atmosphere is really coming through.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. That was a huge talking point for Brent Venables. And I think, to kind of emphasize that, I got a chance to talk to Jonah Laulu at Big 12 Media Days. And he was talking about that just within the defensive line, how they're going to see movies together. They had some sort of barbecue at I believe Todd Bates's house, just how Bates and Chavez are kind of bringing this unit together, because that's another one with a bunch of different transfers, a lot of new faces. So yeah, I think that camaraderie is going to be huge, and it needs to develop quick if OU wants to see some early success.
Yes, and speaking of if OU wants to see some early success, let's talk about the quarterback situation. Obviously, Dylan Gabriel is coming back for his second year with the Sooners to start, we presume. And but there's a little wrinkle this year. You have five-star Jackson Arnold on the bench right behind him and ready to go whenever. I don't think that's going to be a storyline this year, although we've seen it happen before here in Norman. Lewis, what are you looking for from Dylan Gabriel, not only as fall camp gets going, but this season, and what improvements do you think he can and will make?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is just third down, fourth down, those clutch situations. I think his deep ball could get a little better and definitely a little more consistent. There are all these things. And it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to Jackson Arnold being there. Because obviously last year, was his job ever up for grabs? Was it ever threatened? Not really with, Davis Bevel and General Booty behind you. But you got Jackson Arnold this year, 5-star, and just the option of having that. Sure, if Dylan starts out slow in their first Big 12 game against Cincinnati, maybe you don't go right to Jackson Arnold, but he's there and they can use him. And, we saw the Spencer Rattler, Caleb Williams situation only a year and a half ago. So it'll just be interesting to see how he plays, knowing that OU does have a really, really strong next option. And hey, the fans aren't going to be too patient about him either.
Yeah, that's for sure. I'm glad you talked about the third and fourth downs. If I remember correctly, and I covered every single game, but OU was just atrocious on fourth downs, and it did not seem like they converted very many third downs, and it seemed like there was so many drives in this Levy offense last year where the team just went all the way down the field, and when they got to the red zone, they couldn't come up with 6 points. And just you heard the frustration all season long from both Dylan and Lebby. And I'm looking forward to speaking to both of them on Tuesday more about this. But we heard from Dylan at Big 12 just talking about, working with Jeff and trying to slow down the offense. We saw at times last year how it was just pedal to the metal, go, go, go. It's more about being efficient. And there's that word again. Brent Venables uses that word all the time, but that's going to be interesting for sure. For sure. Let's talk some training camp, Lewis. We're gonna go through each of our individual storylines that is most intriguing to us. We are going to go through what position group we're most anxious to see, most under the radar player. We're going to talk newcomers, transfers, who we expect to have a big impact. Lewis, let's start with individual storyline most intriguing to us. What do you got?
Well, I got to go back to that third down, fourth down situation because it was just such a huge weakness for this team last year. And I'm interested to see how they incorporate that in training camp. You know it's going to be a vocal point. There's going to be a ton of talk about it. But how do you really put that into a drill? And how do you stimulate some of these high pressure situations that this team needs to improve on this year? I mean, we're talking about a team that lost at least 3 or 4 games that were one score games or one possession games. So it'll just be interesting to see how they kind of incorporate that into their training camp, those high pressure situations.
Yes, for sure. That's going to be a huge talking point leading up to the season. I'm going to go with something or someone, a player that none of us really were taking seriously until Big 12 media days. I'm not sure there was a player Coach Venables raved about more than Division II Ferris State linebacker Connor Neer. Um, Neer transferred back in May. He has 2 years of eligibility remaining. Uh, wasn't recruited really at all out of St. John's High School in Michigan. Didn't have a 247 page. Didn't have a rivals page. Was recruited by Duke, Cincinnati, Michigan State, and Tech out of the portal, and sounds like what a pickup and what a find by Brent Venables and his staff. I mean, you lose David Agwebu in the portal. You obviously gain Dason McCullough. You have obviously Danny Stutzman and Jared Kanek, who are those are really the three we expect to be the big three manning the linebacker position. But according to Brent and according to what we heard at Big 12 Media Days, this guy's for real, and he expects him to have an impact. So that's really the individual storyline I'm looking toward most. Just a cool little thing for a Division II player who is getting all this hype from one of the best linebacker coaches in the business.
Yeah, definitely, man. Moving on with that, I wanted to talk a little bit just about position groups specifically. If OU is going to have success this year, Colton, what do you feel like is the position group that needs to step up, or what group are you most anxious to watch this year?
Yeah, for sure. For me, it's definitely the defensive line. You bring in transfers, Rondell Bothroyd. He's really the one. You brought in Jacob Lacey, you brought in guys like that, but I'm really extremely excited to see Rondell Bothroyd. He really popped during the spring. We got to chat with him. We got to chat with him once, I believe, and just such a great interview. And we've heard coaches rave about him. And then obviously, and then a guy that you are currently writing about, Lewis, and I can't wait for your story on him. But Dejon Terry from Tennessee, heard good things about him as well, and really looking forward to seeing this new defensive line that the Sooners have. Obviously, it's going to be a huge focal point heading into the SEC in 2024. Obviously, most of those defensive lines in the SEC are NFL defensive lines, and you have to have a good defensive line to compete in that conference. That position group was not very good last year. I don't think that takes a football expert to realize that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what Todd Bates and Miguel Chavis put together, and I think readers will be seeing some more of that from you, Lewis, here in the near future. I can't wait for you to dive into that position group, but that's the one I'm really looking forward to seeing some growth this camp for sure. What about you, Lewis?
Yeah, definitely. I got to talk about the wide receivers a little bit. You get a new wide receivers coach, Emmett Jones from Texas Tech. Not a ton of college experience, but he has been at Tech. He was at Tech first, moved to Kansas for a couple years, then Tech for a year, and now he is with OU. And he has his hands full, kind of. I mean, losing Marvin Mims and then coming back from that, especially with all these young guys. I mean, Oklahoma does not have a receiver on the roster who has a 500-yard season under their belt. So he has his hands full, and these young guys, they really, really got to step up. I think some of the big names you expect to see, Jaleel Farouk, he has a huge opportunity to step into that wide receiver one role. I think Andrell Anthony, transfer from Michigan, is a guy that not many people are talking about. Had a really good first season with Michigan, and then last year didn't get the production that he wanted, but that's a guy that can really, really do damage. And then some of these other guys, and you obviously see Drake Stoops there. That's just kind of your go-to Mr. Reliable. But I think it'll be really, really interesting to see such a young group. How long does it take them to really mesh, to really get that chemistry down with Dylan Gabriel?
Yeah, for sure. That's another storyline that you are going to be diving into here pretty soon. Stay tuned to OUDaily.com for more on Emmett Jones. I'm really excited to read that from you, Lewis. And while you bring up some good points there on Emmett Jones, we're gonna talk about it a little later, but we gotta acknowledge the recruiting job he's been doing of late, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how many recruits is it for 2024? I think there's 16 total commitments for that class. And I want to say six, maybe even seven of them are wide receivers. I
Yeah,
mean, he's just tearing it up. And a good amount of those guys have come from around that Dallas area. That's where Emmett Jones, he got his start around there. He's very, very familiar with the high school football game around there. So I think just those connections are really helping out.
for sure. And that's a good segue into my most inch or we are on most under the radar player now. Yeah, that's a good segue into my most under the radar player. Let's keep it with the receiver group. Let's keep it in the Lone Star State. I'm going with Jacquez Petaway. A lot of people forget about this guy. A lot of people forget about him and Samuel Omosigo because they weren't early enrollees. But other than Jackson Arnold, Peyton Bowen, and PJ Adebore, Jacquez Petaway was the highly recruited guy in OU's class last year. And you talked about that receiver group. I think he's going to have a quick impact. Like you said, there's not very much depth. You obviously have Drake Stoops, Mr. Reliable. You obviously have Jalil Farouk. You obviously have Andrew Anthony. I think Jacquez Petaway could fly up that depth chart pretty quickly. He was a 5-star guy on a lot of sites. I think On3 had him as a 4-star, as well as 247. I think ESPN had him as the number 7 wide receiver in the country. Just the speed on this guy. I think he was a track star at Langham Creek High School. Watch out for Jacquez Petaway. I'm really, really anxious to see if we speak to him at all this fall. And since we got all the newcomers in the spring, but we didn't ever get to talk to the non-early enrollees. So really excited to see what he does this camp and um, see if he makes an impression on the coaching staff.
Yeah, definitely. And for my guy, it would have been tough last December to say that Peyton Bowen is flying under the radar after he committed to Oregon, and then a couple days later signed with Oklahoma, and before that he was a longtime Notre Dame commit. So, but I think just his impact this first year and just what kind of player he is. I mean, this is the number 2 prospect, the number 2 safety in the 2023 class, according to 247. I mean, this is a playmaker. This is a guy who you get who can have an immediate impact on that defense. It's going to be really, really interesting to see with that secondary how much playing time he gets and how much of an effect he can have this year.
Yeah, no, for sure. I expect that's another guy I expect to we will see pretty soon on, like, pretty early on in the season. I don't think he's going to be sitting on the bench for too long. Lewis, shall we jump into our newcomers and transfers discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start us off there. I mean, I think Dason McCullough transfer from Indiana really stands out to me, and he stood out to me the first spring practice I went to. I mean, he's just this huge. I think they have him listed as 6'6" linebacker. And he's a disruptor. I mean, we saw what he could do at Indiana, very productive there, and I think you expect the same here at Oklahoma. Going to be playing alongside Danny Stutzman. Just that linebacker room, it's such a critical part of any defense. And boy, if you can have those two guys working well together, I mean, it's kind of scary, really.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Like we talked about earlier, I think that big three linebackers with him, Danny and Jaron is just gonna be a monster. I think this might be a stretch, but I think maybe not this season, but next season if they all return, I think you got a chance to have three All Americans there at that position. Uh, but anyway, more transferred newcomers. I mean, we can really just go down the list. We talked Bothroyd, obviously. Um, you know, Dason, and then the freshman with Peyton Bowen, Jacquez Petaway. But you've also got, we talked receivers. Another guy we just didn't talk about who is kind of under the radar is Brennan Thompson, who, right when Emmett Jones got the job, he pretty much, brought Brennan over, got Brennan to come over from Texas. You got some guys, on the offensive line. That's a position group that I probably would have gone with second on my most intriguing position group, because that is that's a doozy. We could talk forever about that one, but you add Caleb Schaefer from Miami, Ohio. You add Walter Rouse, who I expect to be the starting left tackle from Stanford, and you can go read a really good feature from our Jason Batacchio on him on OUDaily.com. You got guys like Reggie Pearson Jr., who came over from Tech with Emmett Jones. He's a safety and who coaches have talked a lot about. So, and not to mention, Trace Ford coming over from OU's in-state rival. There's a lot of newcomers and there's a lot of transfers who, Brent Venables is depending on having a big impact. I mean, just going back to the offensive line, I mean, Walter Rouse is coming off an injury. Walter Rouse, he's barely getting to know Bill Bedenbaugh and working with this unit. So it's going to be very, very interesting for sure. You have anything else to say on that front, Lewis?
I don't think so. I think you hit it pretty well. That offensive line, especially with Anton Harrison and Wanya Morris, they lost those two guys to the draft last year. Like you said, Walter Rouse, expect him to have a huge impact. And it's so crucial when you think about also Dylan Gabriel and the year he needs to have and the protection he needs to have, especially with all these young weapons in order to have success.
For sure. For sure. Lewis, we're going to get into recruiting because it's been a huge month, really, of recruiting. And we obviously had Party at the Palace this past weekend. But is there any other, we've talked position groups, we've talked individual players. What questions do you have going into Tuesday? And what position groups do you think have battles going on in them ahead of training camp?
Well, maybe not a battle here, but I'm looking in that backfield, not so much at the quarterback. I'm looking at the running backs here. Eric Gray, you lost him last year. So Javante Barnes is the name that really, really sticks out. Expect him to have a huge role in this offense. But looking last year, looking at that game against Florida State, Oklahoma was introduced to Gavin Sawchuk, really, who went for 100 yards rushing and a touchdown. I don't think you can ignore that, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see if they use him and kind of try to create that Joe Mixon, Samaje Perine type of backfield that they had years ago. So I think just that dynamic in the running back room, it's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the start of spring, if you would have asked me, I would have went straight to Javante Barnes like you just did after the Cheez-It Bowl he had. But he got injured. He got injured in spring. I caught him wheeling around practice on a scooter with a wrap on his right leg, I believe. And Gavin Sawchuk had all of spring to take advantage of his opportunities, and I think really flew up the DeMarco Murray's list. And I would expect Gavin Sawchuk to have a really big impact this season. But that's going to be a fun and intriguing position group. I'm glad you brought that one up to watch this season. Shall we talk some recruiting? You got anything else, Lewis? Let's just touch on this real quick. What coach or player, we don't know what players we're getting Tuesday yet, but what coach are you most looking forward to talking to on Tuesday, and what player do you hope we get to talk to on Tuesday?
Well, I think Emmett Jones is one that I gotta say. I mean, but first off, for our football mag, look for a story about him to come out. I'm working on one right now, but I gotta say, Emmett Jones, he always gives really, really good, insightful, in-depth answers. So I'm just excited to kind of pick his brain about how he's attacking, just coaching this wide receiver group, especially with just so much inexperience there and a huge void to fill with the absence of Marvin Mims. So very excited to talk to him. As far as players we get, I've heard a lot about Dejon Terry, and I'd like to talk to him because, I remember Jonah at a Big 12 Media Days told me he's huge, and he just shocked him the first time he saw him. So maybe we'll get to talk to him, or just one of those defensive line transfers. That would be really, really interesting.
For sure, definitely. Let's talk some Oklahoma football recruiting. Definitely gets fans all riled up this time of year, especially when there's no football being played. But this summer, Brent and his staff have really cooked, especially here in the last, I would say, month or so. And it really started off with 2024 receiver Ivan. I don't really know how to pronounce his name, but Ivan Carrion. I'm not really sure. Out of Odessa High School, 4-star receiver. And then Emmett comes back nearly a month later and snags Zion Reagan's, another 4-star receiver. And then he comes back literally like 4 days later and grabs Jacob Jordan, a 3-star out of South Lake Carroll. And we all know South Lake Carroll has developed some really good players over the years. But what are some commitments that have really raised your eyebrows, Lewis?
Well, obviously we've talked about it, but just all the wide receivers, and I really think Taylor Tatum, for a while there, he was really, really 50-50. And at one point, if you would have asked me, I would have said maybe USC. That's what it was kind of seeming like, kind of the vibe that I got, that he was going to choose USC. But towards the end there, Oklahoma really started to stand out, and just to see, just to have a running back like that coming in next year is going to be really, really big for OU.
Yes, for sure. And I saw were you talking about Taylor Tatum there?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I heard he's playing in some sort of like baseball showcase on like MLB Network tonight. He's another one of those dual athletes. So yeah, for sure. That was a big, big, big one. Number one running back in the class, in the nation. But yeah, you got other guys like Davon Mitchell, a 4-star tight end out of Los Alamitos, California. So this class is really coming together. You've also got some high profile 2025 commits recently. I mean, obviously over in the spring, you had quarterback Kevin Sperry, but landing a 4-star Elijah Thomas, another receiver that Emmett Jones went out and got from Chakota, Oklahoma. That was pretty big last week. Lewis, this was fun, man. I'm really looking forward to Tuesday, and really looking forward to this coming week and training camp getting going. Apologize if I glossed over anything. Is there anything else you want to bring up?
I don't think so. It's football season, man. It's back, and I'm super excited for it.
For sure, man. Really excited to have you on the beat this year. This is going to be my last year covering football. Obviously, Austin and Mason, who I covered the beat with last year, are gone. Bringing aboard both Lewis and our other editor, Jason Batacchio, this year. So really looking forward to, just the road trips and covering games and practices and everything that goes along with covering this juggernaut of a beat with you guys. So I'm really looking forward to it. And we'll catch you guys on the next episode. But I'm Colton Sulley. That was Lewis Raser. And we'll talk to you guys soon. See ya.